Hello and welcome to this virtual roundtable hosted by Grow Opportunity Magazine in collaboration with the Cannabis Council of Canada. I'm Marilyn de Guzman and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Before we begin, just some housekeeping reminders. You, the audience, will be in listen-only mode, but you have the opportunity to type in your questions to our panelists in the question box located on your webinar panel. We will do our best to get to as many questions from the audience as possible. You may pose your questions at any time during the discussion. This session is also being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording via email that will come to your inbox in about 24 hours. Today's panel will focus on the issues and challenges around counterfeit cannabis. This has been an issue that's emerging in the cannabis industry. Counterfeit products are certainly not a new phenomenon and something that other major industries and companies are dealing with. The issue of counterfeit cannabis not only has economic implications for businesses, but more importantly, it poses a risk to public health and safety. So let's dive into this subject and let me introduce to you our excellent panel today. First up is Lorne Lipkus. He's the founding partner at Kestenberg, Siegal, Lipkus, LLP, and chair of the Education and Training Committee at the Canadian Anti-Counterfeiting Network. Hi, Lorne.
Hi, good morning, Marilyn. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And next up is Spencer Mandy. He's the general manager at Payment Systems Canada and Banknote Operations at the Canadian Banknote Company. Welcome, Spencer.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Unfortunately, our third panelist, Ken Deutsch, is unable to join us today due to personal reasons. We certainly wish Ken the best. All right, let's start in. I think I want to start our discussion with just giving you, Lorne and Spencer, the opportunity to just talk about your background, your organization, and the things that you're doing in this space. Let's start with you, Lorne.
Okay, well, as you said, I'm a partner at Kestenberg, Siegal, Lipkus. They're a Toronto-based firm. I'm the partner in charge of the intellectual property department. Our firm represents over 100 brands in various brand protection matters, and we've done so for many years. In fact, more years than I'm prepared to admit to. I regularly assist those brands in protecting their trademarks, their copyrights, their other intellectual properties, including their trade secrets, and in preventing fraud against their businesses and their products. Our office has 4 lawyers dedicated to this area of law, along with a staff of paralegals, including online and offline investigators. Our investigators deal with the brick and mortar establishments dealing in counterfeit or illegal products and offline locations, including marketplaces, social media, websites, and any other place that you can think of where illicit products bearing our clients' intellectual properties are found. I've worked extensively with law enforcement, various government agencies, customs, Canada revenue agencies in Canada, as well as their equivalent in various other countries. I've been consulted in the past and continue to be by cannabis industry participants on anti-counterfeiting and brand protection matters, as well as law enforcement and others. While I have not personally had direct involvement in actual anti-counterfeiting cases yet, that's primarily, I believe, because the cannabis industry is new and they have been looking at law enforcement to provide assistance. Many of the businesses that are involved in the cannabis space have not yet turned their attention to the dangers of counterfeit cannabis products bearing their names and logos. And as many of us know, there is counterfeit cannabis in Canada. It's here. It's in large quantity, and it is found to be potentially fatally dangerous. In speaking with police officers, they've come across counterfeit cannabis bearing the trade names of legitimate businesses containing cannabis that was not prepared by the legitimate business that contains fentanyl. And as we all know, fentanyl is a very dangerous and potentially fatal drug that has no business being in legitimate cannabis. Police have been increasingly coming across this counterfeit cannabis product across the country, and some of their involvement have been reported in the media across the country. And I hope to share some of my experiences as we get to some questions.
Yeah, Spencer?
That was well done, Lorne. Thanks. I don't know how to follow that up. I'm Spencer Mandy. I'm the general manager for banknote operations and payment systems Canada for the Canadian Banknote Company. We're a security company, privately owned, but we are part of Canada's national security infrastructure. We've been around since 1897, and we're commissioned to actually deliver the first stamps for the new Dominion of Canada when the railroad was completed. We were created by an act of Parliament. We currently have presence in over 80 countries and have done the national currency for Canada since the formation of the central bank in 1935. We have branched out into secure digital and physical identification, including all of Canadian passports and other international clients. Particularly for me, and what's applicable here, I guess, is I've been part of the excise program that started for tobacco since 2007, and of course has expanded recently into the new industry of cannabis. And look forward to being part of this panel today.
And I
Right,
want to make clear that I have not been working as long as they've been helping out on the banknote side.
right. So let's start with let's set. I guess we can set the stage right. And in our previous discussions, Lauren, you made an important distinction between our about our topic today, that counterfeit cannabis is different than contraband cannabis. Can you expound on this, and why is it important to make that distinction?
Well, cannabis is a regulated industry, so it's regulated in a way that regular products are not. So when you have a regular product, a regular consumer product, for example, that's protected by a copyright or a trademark, and it's sold in a store, then all of these intellectual property laws come into place. There's a Trademarks Act and a Copyright Act, and we have other acts that assist in determining whether something is illegal or not. A primary focus for us being on the fact that it's counterfeit. And those laws relate to the packaging as well as the product. When you come into the cannabis space, well, we have the Cannabis Act, and we have, including the Cannabis Act, I made a list of them, and there are a lot of various statutes just in Canada that relate to the regulation of cannabis. As a result, when you're looking at the counterfeit and the illicit trade, you have to be mindful of both sides, the intellectual property side and the fact that as a regulated industry, there are other players involved. And that could mean Health Canada, it could mean Canada Revenue Agency. There are other agencies that get involved. So there is a distinction between them. And because it's so highly regulated, law enforcement will probably get more involved in counterfeit cannabis cases than they will in other types of cases because of those different laws.
Right. And Spencer, from your perspective, I guess you'll be dealing more with that counterfeit in that counterfeit space where your service or your products are concerned, right?
Yeah, I think there's two primary distinctions for me. You first have to define the problem you're trying to solve, and contraband versus counterfeit, they're two different problems with two sets of risks. And while they do intersect, I think ensuring protection of the legitimate brands specific to Canada, I think, is critical to the success of such a young industry. So I think in addressing the counterfeit problem, we have to make sure we understand the issues at play and the problems we're trying to solve.
To follow up, Spencer, you work with licensed producers. How are you working with licensed producers in ensuring that appropriate security measures are in place for their products? And I know there's some issues and concerns, or industry about the excise stamps and those types of things. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the excise program in Canada was born for tobacco. That's where it started. That's the history of it. And upon, some would say it wasn't rapid enough, but I think for policymakers, certainly at the different levels of government, the national legalization of cannabis moved quite quickly. And they ran into a challenge to try to regulate, put in the framework to regulate this industry. And one of the natural progressions for the federal government, who, I want to make it clear, I don't speak for the federal government, I am their provider, for the excise program, but having the view into basically how CRA and Health Canada were scrambling to try to develop framework that allowed this industry to be successful. And I think there were some pains during that implementation, and I think some of those pains continue, including the expansion of the excise stamp program. It's a very important program, and one of the natural defaults is the Canadian government, CRA specifically, was adamant that the problem in tobacco needed to be addressed in 2007, whereby there was overproduction and there was massive counterfeiting, both imports into the country that ended up in our domestic markets, and there was overproduction happening by both legitimate and illegitimate players. And they came, well, they released a public RFP, but our response, our solution is at a banknote grade level of security. So in terms of being able to counterfeit the product label that we provide to the industry under regulation of the CRA is not something that can be counterfeited. So from our perspective, you know, there's multiple layers to counterfeit protection, but this is the first step in a closed loop system. And so we have a value added offering where we can go further with the LPs to start to talk about what that full closed loop system of counterfeit protection looks like. But I can tell you a quick story about when we were first introducing the program for the tobacco industry. It was resisted, and it was resisted quite quite loudly, if I can use that term. But in the end, I actually had the president of one of the major 3 tobacco companies come to me and say, you know, it was a painful transition, but now that we're 3 or 4 years in, or whatever it was at the time, he said, this is the cheapest brand protection program that I could have hoped for. And it was actually on the heel, that conversation was right on the heels of a major shipment that was seized in Halifax by the RCMP. And the packaging for that brand, I mean, now we've gone to plain packaging, but at the time they still had the branded packaging, and they were perfect counterfeits. And what they found, and it was a whole, it was quite a large shipment. I think it was worth $5 or $10 million. But what they found when they actually analyzed the tobacco was that it was full of, not that tobacco is necessarily healthy, but this stuff did not meet any of the Health Canada regulations. It was full of formaldehyde at very dangerous levels. It was full of rodent feces, all kinds of unregulated stuff that would have harmed any of the consumers. And I think that's the intent partly of the start of the excise program. But again, I think we have to push to a closed loop solution at an individual company level for the LPs.
You know, Spencer, if I could add to what you've said and comment, as Spencer knows, my experience with the tobacco industry took place in the early 2000s when the cigar industry just became an explosion in the marketplace. And as the legitimate product became very popular, so did the counterfeit. And predating Spencer's company's involvement, which really assisted all tobacco industries because they really paved the way, predating that, the cases we were involved in involved cardboard packaging or that type of packaging for cigars. There was no brand protection technology built in like we have now with the cannabis packaging. The supply chain might have been on the secure side, but if you don't have a way to easily tell if something is counterfeit, and if you're not explaining and educating your partners in the process and in the supply chain, then you run into a problem. And the cigar industry ran into a huge problem. And there were hundreds of cases of counterfeit and raids by the RCMP and by Canada Revenue Agency and other Health Canada, and all of these groups got together and had these raids, and the stamp at the time on the package was so easily copied that it provided virtually no protection at all. Even the legitimate ones would come off at the time. And then that meant that something had to be done. And as a result, you get into what Spencer's talking about, which totally revolutionized this industry. And as a result, the cannabis industry is benefiting from that learning process. Where I don't think the cannabis industry has come yet is they haven't secured the supply chain and the educational process. They have been so busy trying to produce a product, get their rights protected, and then move into the selling, that they don't always realize that the number one asset, and Spencer, your take on this would be certainly appreciated, but most businesses that I'm aware of say their number one asset is their intellectual property, their trademarks, their logos, their names, their copyrights. That's what they need to protect. And just registering them with Canadian Intellectual Property Office doesn't do the job. You have to go out there and take steps and not only know that the label that Spencer's talking about is on your product, but what it does and how the consumer, your customer should know that if they don't see that, there's steps that they should take.
Right. So talking about the parallels between the tobacco, I'm sure there's also some parallels because the Canadian industry, I guess, the cannabis industry is such a is still in the early stages of it. There's really not a lot of tracking that's being done. There's no real data out there right now about counterfeit cannabis. How important is it for the industry to track this emerging trend, and what are the maybe the risks of this not being addressed, early on in the in this development?
Well, I
Let's,
think,
yeah,
is that okay,
Spencer?
Marilyn?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So I think it's a really good point you raise. I think the cannabis industry is in a wonderful position. You know, one of the challenges with tobacco is that it is such a much older industry, and for cannabis at this naissance place in their development as a market, you've got the opportunity to put protections in place. I mean, one of the things I can speak directly to just as a banknote producer, you know, the better we get at anti-counterfeiting, the better the nefarious players get. Their technology is very good, and they do chase it. So from my perspective, we have an opportunity as a young industry to use some technology at a very high level of security to prevent, if not, totally prevent, certainly curb the counterfeit activity that we're starting to see. And in terms of tracking, I think it's absolutely critical to track counterfeit in this market, in any market, frankly, because a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And if you know what you're facing, then you know how to address it, or at least you have the start of knowing how to address it. And for us, we protect national currencies. And if you have a counterfeit bill, it only needs to pass once. We feel the same way when it comes to any sort of protected product, right? To Lorne's earlier point, a company's IP is their lifeblood. And if Canadian cannabis, if I can use that term, starts to be counterfeited and it's not at the quality that our Canadian companies are producing, we're going to lose that reputation very quickly as other national entities start to regulate and legalize adult use marijuana.
That was really, really well said, and I agree wholeheartedly with your comments, Spencer. Marilyn, if you look at some other industries, to your question, I'll point out to one or two, but the Imaging Supplies Coalition, those are the companies that almost every company, every major manufacturer and seller of inkjet cartridges, toner cartridges, those companies got together. And in the United States, to do that and not contravene some sort of law is really difficult because they can't collude. You don't want these companies colluding and doing anything to have the public think that they're trying to set prices or do anything like that. They are competitors. They really fight like crazy for their product to be number one in the marketplace. And yet, every year and a half, they have a conference, they get together, they share ideas about how to stop counterfeiters. So this industry made up of all of these competitors together go after counterfeiters. They share information about counterfeiters. There's no point in one cannabis supplier or manufacturer stopping someone from doing something and not sharing that information, because otherwise they're just going to go to another brand and eventually they'll come back to you when, as Spencer says, they get better. Eventually they'll come back to you because they're greedy and they're stubborn and they'll keep coming after you. So if you look at what the Imaging Supplies Coalition has done, it's great. In the United States, they have an organization called A2C2, the Anti-Counterfeiting Automotive Council. 13, I believe it's 13, of the large original equipment manufacturers get together. We all know nobody competes harder against one another than the car companies. And yet together they train customs. Together they lobby for better laws. Together they share information on counterfeiting operations around the world. That's where the cannabis industry has to go.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to that, if I may, Lauren. I think you're bang on. The one thing I would add is as your popularity and as the industry matures, and we've seen this in other industries, especially with legalization, as your product becomes more mainstream and the black market and gray market start to diminish. In other words, the contraband starts to diminish. You're going to see the counterfeits increase, and you're going to see them increase dramatically. So we need to be prepared.
Right. And it seems like the cannabis industry has the benefit of the experience of other industries for when they start addressing this, and they have point frames of references, I guess, that they can go forward with. It's just a matter of getting that initiative going.
I think so. I think a lot of work is already being done. I mean, if you look at some of the studies that are out there with online buying, such as Alibaba and Google, there's been some good work done to track counterfeit product in this space, namely around vapes, but also online sales. And it's happening now. And it's something that there are ways to learn, to your point, from other industries who have been down this road already.
Right. Lauren, let me ask you, what are there any sort of responsibilities from a legal perspective? What are the responsibilities and potential liabilities for producers whose products are being counterfeited?
Well,
Are there liabilities there?
well, if it's not your product, you won't necessarily be liable for causing harm, but who wants to see their name on the front page of every major media outlet across Canada because your product is the one that was counterfeited? It doesn't do you any good if you win your court case down the road, because in the court of public opinion, people will go, well, I'll stay away from that product because they're being counterfeited. And the reality is, there is more counterfeit out there than anybody could possibly believe. It's not like we have the cannabis police looking out and going through the marketplace looking for counterfeit. It's not like we have the toy police going and looking for counterfeit toys. You are only as good as the people who find it. And we generally are good at catching the counterfeiters that make mistakes. So until we actually have a program in place for people to go in the marketplace and know what they're looking for, it's hard to know what counterfeit is out there. If you own the rights to a product and you do nothing to protect it, and if people start using your name, the name of your product, and you don't do anything about it, eventually that name could be a generic name. They came out with a toy that I don't know if anyone remembers it, called a yo-yo. It's called the hula hoop. These toys came out and their intellectual property wasn't protected. It wasn't registered. As a result of which, people started calling the little round toy a yo-yo, even though the yo-yo company had the rights to that name. But they lost that because they didn't enforce it. So to your question specifically, there are ways that you can hurt your rights by not enforcing them. And if you allow other people to get in there, then they could take over your name. We all remember the word Xerox. When Xerox came out with photocopying, people would say, here, can you go Xerox this? And then Xerox had campaigns saying it's not a Xerox, it's a Xerox photocopy. It's a Xerox this. So the same thing with any name that you can think of. When it becomes so ubiquitous that people start using your name as the main name, you could lose the rights to it. And also, you don't want someone that you go after to come into court and say, well, everybody is selling it. It's everywhere and they're not doing anything about it, so I thought it was okay. All of a sudden, you're creating problems for yourself within the market. So all copyright and all trademark owners have an obligation to protect their trademark if they want to keep their trademark.
You have anything to add, Spencer?
No, I'm not a lawyer. What I will say, though, I think Lauren's absolutely bang on. I think one of the primary risks is that reputational risk, especially in a consumable market where people are, either smoking or ingesting or what have you in terms of this product. You have to keep it safe, because if there's a fraudulent name and a counterfeit product that isn't safe, that's going to be the story. It's not going to be the story that it wasn't cannabis company ABC's product. The story is going to be that a counterfeit product hurt somebody, and that is what we need to protect against as we legitimize this market.
I want to get to some audience questions here. We have a question. Counterfeit cannabis seems to be mostly about the packaging. Why should the government be responsible via excise stamps for IP protection? Shouldn't IP protection be solely on the company's shoulders? Lorne, you want to take this? Is it just mostly about packaging, counterfeit?
There is counterfeit cannabis. There is cannabis that is cannabis, but it wasn't made by the company who purported to make it. If the name Lipkus is allowed to make cannabis and it's Lipkus cannabis, my trademark is Lipkus. And I'm just saying that, but let's say the trademark was Lipkus. That means that when a consumer purchases that product, the origin of that product is the Lipkus brand, the Lipkus company. The moment someone else copies my name, they're leading the public to believe that the origin of that product is Lipkus, that Lipkus made it, even though that actual cannabis product is substandard. So that's bad, and that's bad for Lipkus. That's bad for the Lipkus brand. So we definitely don't want that. Now, when you think of, and because there's one part of your question that I want to get to, and that is whether this is a problem that should be addressed by the copyright or trademark owner, or why the government is involved. There are a lot of reasons why the government is involved, especially as it relates to cannabis or tobacco, because these are highly regulated, and they want to make sure that the product that's being sold in the marketplace is safe. I've given the example of fentanyl. If the company doesn't have the resources to go after as many counterfeiters as the government, how are we going to keep Canadians safe? And let's not forget the second point, which is a key point. Very well-respected studies have determined that in the past few years, the number 2 method of financing of organized crime and terrorists to perform their illicit activities is the sale of counterfeit products. The only thing they do that makes more money for them is sell drugs. Number 2, worldwide. Look at the Interpol site. Look at any of international anti-counterfeiting organization. Number 2, we all know that. How is any company able to access information that's only available to law enforcement? It's only available to Health Canada. It's only available to Canada Revenue Agency. It's only available to Canada Border Services, and then pick those organizations in other countries. No company has that information. We have to partner together. We must work with government to make sure that the laws work. We have to work with government agencies, and we have to work with law enforcement and customs and their partners to give them the information they need. They want to know how to tell if Lipkus made that brand of product or not, so we can assist them in doing that. We might know where to buy it. We can assist them to do that. In the regular anti-counterfeiting world, not related to tobacco, brands regularly partner with law enforcement and customs because they don't have the information. And we all agree that privacy legislation can be a very good thing. We don't want all of our personal information out there, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to stop criminals from doing illegal things and harming the public. So without partnering with law enforcement and without partnering with private brands, we can't solve any problems.
Spencer?
Yeah, I agree, Lauren. You know, in short, from my perspective, I think you have to take an integrated approach. I think you need, at every level of government, you need the framework, you need the legislative framework, you need the regulatory framework, you need the enforcement framework, but it's also an onus on the companies individually, because I don't think in a counterfeit situation, you don't just hurt the one company being counterfeited, you hurt the overall industry. And as Canada continues to strive, the Canadian cannabis industry continues to strive, proving legitimacy, growing on exportations, developing the reputation that we've enjoyed to date, and furthering that reputation in a positive way, we have to be seen as doing our due diligence and everything we can at all levels of government and within the private sector to counteract the counterfeit threat.
So if somebody buys a cannabis infused product that was not made by a legitimate company, but it has their name on it, and they eat it and they die because it's got some sort of poison in it, like fentanyl or something else, and they die, or they're seriously injured, who is harmed? The company is harmed. Canadians are harmed. We are all harmed. We all have to partner together.
Right. And I think we've seen that with the vape, that certainly with the vape incidences that happened last year, you know, sort of some lot of lessons learned from that one as well.
Lessons learned that people were putting the names of the companies on there, and the companies weren't making those products, and people were being damaged by the counterfeits.
That's right.
Right.
I mean, I think we have a really good parallel, if I can share a quick story just on ice wine in general, right? We have a beautiful Canadian product that's specific to Canada, and it's about a 55% counterfeit rate sold in China as a very, very popular product. And the VQA came out, you know, sort of as the collective of the industry to try to counteract the counterfeiting. Now, I don't believe what the VQA has done is enough. I think it needs to go further as a program, and I think, you know, the Canadian the Canadian Cannabis Council is well positioned to help the industry achieve that. I think that the collective approach to protecting our industry is the only way to go forward.
Excellent example.
Right. Another question here. To what degree do you see brand trust and product safety being reliant upon anti-counterfeit measures?
Well, I think we've kind of answered that with the last two answers that Spencer and I gave. But you know, just to repeat, they're part and parcel. They have to go together. You have to have a secure supply chain, and you have to have certainty in the industry. And by putting a product on it, an anti-counterfeiting protection device, I'll call it, or technology, that for what Spencer's doing, what his company is doing, you have the ability to educate the consumer to know what to look for. They just have to pick it up and know. When we're educated on money, most businesses are given some sort of education in how to detect a counterfeit banknote, because they don't want to be taking in a counterfeit banknote. And it's the businesses that are working together to make sure that doesn't happen that are helping stop that problem. And it's really, the problem is under control for the most part because everybody is educated. So now you've got a label on a cannabis product. We have to educate all of the people selling it. We have to educate the consumer to know what to look for. Most consumers can look at a legitimate dollar bill of any denomination in Canada and know that it has all sorts of anti-counterfeiting protection measures on there. There's lots of technology, most of which we're not even allowed to know about, and very few people know about. And even Spencer, who knows more than all of us put together about it, doesn't know all of it because it's compartmentalized and it's very secure. And if I'm wrong, Spencer, and you know about all the technologies, then you know that's amazing.
I would never claim to know all of it. We keep that separate. That's part of our threat deterrence strategy.
Right.
Nobody knows everything. But I think
right.
it's a good point you make. I mean, I think there's a physical aspect to protection. security in general is a layered approach. I think anybody who's spent any time in protecting anything knows that it's not there is no silver bullet, and we've got a lot of technological advances at our disposal. I think there's a physical aspect to the security, the packaging itself, securing supply chains, things of this nature. But what do we do then with all that data, and how do we manage that? Because I think we have to be able to bring all of the information together in a way that allows that partnership we spoke of at all levels of government and with industry to be able to combat the threat. And I think we're starting that conversation. And I kudos to C3 for putting this together, because I don't think we've had this conversation yet as an industry, and it's a really good one. And there's a lot of knowledge to bring to bear out there, historical knowledge on counterfeiting and what the threat is and how we think it might be applied to the cannabis industry.
Right. So to follow on that, I have there's another question here, and I'm not sure if you're you have the if you can answer the best. How are we supposed to work with the government when this latter is not transparent on the first place? So are you seeing government any sort of government initiatives or actions around this particular issue? Like, what are you seeing from the government side of things?
It's a great question. It's a tough question to answer because of the both the levels of government and I'll call it a siloed structure of government. So, what CRA is trying to achieve through the excise program is not necessarily the same objectives as what Health Canada is trying to achieve through their licensing program. So it's a really hard question to answer. I think there is collaboration, and I think, at least from my perspective, I've seen the collaboration. I mean, we spent almost 4 years consulting to the tobacco industry prior to the program. Now, unfortunately, the cannabis industry didn't get that consultation because it didn't really exist. It was there, not there one day, and then, oh, I know this is dramatic, but almost overnight, the legislation was in place the next day. And there was a lot of involvement, I think, with the growers at the Health Canada level, not so much at the enforcement or the revenue protection level. So I think there's opportunity to improve. And another important factor is that the government is only internal to the, it's domestic. So the government can only go as far as our own borders. And I think they've gone somewhat further than any other program in terms of how they're protecting the excise revenue, which by nature protects the product. But I know a lot of companies, a lot of the LPs we're in business with and talking to are very concerned about their exports as the international market grows. They're concerned about the medicinal that is less than 0.3% THC that's going out without an excise stamp on it, or some sort of brand protection or some sort of protection period. So I think those things need to be addressed, and I think they need to be addressed in collaboration with government. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Do I think the government is not trying? No, I think they are trying. I don't think they necessarily have all of the levers that they would like to pull at their disposal. And I think that's where the industry and an organization like C3 comes in to really, be the voice of the industry, of a new industry, that we're learning some things as we go. And I think the government's willing to listen. Again, I don't speak for them, but I hope. Maybe I'm an optimist. I hope they're willing to listen.
Marilyn, I'm the past chair of the Canadian Anti-Counterfeiting Network and the current chair of their Education and Training Committee. And years ago, when we realized there was the type of problem that you asked the question about, and Spencer's just given a great answer about, we went to the government and we said we want to form what we called an IPR, Intellectual Property Rights Working Group, an informal get-together every few months with government. And the government went along with it, and it's continuing. And it was wonderful because at the same table, we usually met in Ottawa. People could access remotely if they didn't want to travel to Ottawa. And for a few hours, government agencies, whoever was responsible for the laws relating to intellectual properties, whoever was responsible for the laws relating to customs, people at the Canada Border Services, people at Canada Revenue, Health Canada, a number of other agencies, and a number of industry representatives. So we had the Canadian Anti-Counterfeiting Network, we had the Intellectual Property Council, we had any other organizations that wanted to be at that table. And we also invited brands. And if particular brands wanted to be there, it was fantastic because that was an opportunity to say something once to the government for it to be heard by the various agencies. And it's really, really hard to get something done in government, through the government, starting from scratch. You need a lot of help. So again, it comes back to the theme that we've talked about, which is partnership. You have to get together with other groups. Within this IPR working group, we had people from all kinds of industries, believe it or not, including the tobacco industry. They actually had someone there for some of these meetings. So it's a partnership that you have to be involved in. And there's one example, just be part of the IPR working group.
Right. I want to get to the exports in a little while, but there's another question here that's interesting along this line. And talking about the smaller players, I believe we're seeing an increase in sort of licenses that are being issued for craft cannabis or small batch producers. In the context of this conversation, like what role or opportunities do you see for small players? This is a question. Do the panelists see any room in the market for a small player operating in legal but simpler system?
I say yes. There's all kinds of small players. When I say that I act for over 100 brands, I would say the majority of brands are not as big as people think. Not everybody is Nike or Apple or Louis Vuitton. There are a lot of brands and a lot of individual smaller companies, especially ones that start up. When they start, what do they need to do? They have to have some protection. They have to file their trademarks. They have to create rights, and then they have to register them. And you can do that. And it's not wildly expensive. You can be a small player and still do the right things. And by joining together with other small players, you can become a small player that has the same impact as a big player. And that is throughout any industry that you can think of. They have that ability. You know,
Yeah,
the one that just popped into my mind is you look at how big some of the convenience stores are. And if you have a large convenience store chain, look at those economies of scale. So what did the small convenience stores do? The ones that had one or two stores, they formed an association together and they were able to get those economies of scale. So yeah, for sure we can help the small businesses.
Yeah, I think it's even more important for the small businesses. For craft cannabis, I think they're differentiating themselves on the quality, on their approach, and I think that needs to be absolutely protected. And I think their brand needs to be protected even more so than, because I think one of the things that we're going to see, and this comes to sort of where our society seems to be heading, but I think shop local is becoming powerful, and I think people are during lockdown starting to stay a little closer to home. So those intimate brands that consumers know, they want to be assured that it is the brand they know and love. And I think that's going to be very critical to the success of the craft cannabis companies.
Right. So let's change gears a little bit. So you mentioned exports and the global market earlier. So what, as the industry begins looking outward to the global market with cannabis exports, how does counterfeit cannabis impact these efforts, and what are you seeing in the global scenes right now in terms of from this perspective? Lorne, okay, start
From
with you.
the exports from Canada to other countries.
Right.
So I have way too much to say about that because Canada is known to be a major exporter to other countries of counterfeit products. I don't know how many people know that, but we don't have a very good reputation in that regard. The good news is that we have changed our laws in the last 5 years, as specifically as it relates to intellectual property, and it is illegal under our Trademarks Act, and it came in with the Combating Counterfeit Products Act, it is illegal to export a counterfeit product to outside of Canada. Well, what does that mean? Well, we have something called an RFA program. RFA, the acronym for Request for Assistance. Canada has a program where anybody that owns a registered Canadian trademark or owns a copyright, whether it's registered or not, has the right and the opportunity to file a very simple form to prepare with Canada Border Services, with CBSA, to basically record those rights with customs. And if customs is aware of or determines that there is a shipment of your product with your name on it that is counterfeit, that is either coming into the country, but to your question, being exported out of the country, they have the right to detain it. And then you have the right to say to customs, oh, you've given me information on who the exporter is, how to contact them, who they are, what the product is. You've given me the ability to determine it's not my product, and now you can take a step to enforce your rights in the civil courts to stop that product from being exported, or if it's an importation, being imported. It sounds like a lot of work that's going to make a lot of money for lawyers suing people and going to court. But the reality is we've been involved in hundreds and hundreds of these cases. It is less than 1% of the time that it actually becomes a court case, because when customs determines that it's suspected of being counterfeit and it's determined to be counterfeit, invariably, when you give notice of that to the importer or the exporter, they don't want to be involved with an illegal product, and they, in 99% of the cases, they voluntarily abandon the shipment. Done. Very little cost, no necessity to have a legal action, and it's the subject matter of another talk just dealing with customs enforcement. But suffice to say, easy to prepare yourself for free. You can prepare that form. There's no charge to file it, and we help people for free. It's so easy to prepare the form. The government came out with the easiest possible form to fill out. So take advantage of it and protect your rights.
Yeah,
Spencer?
I think it's a good step, Lauren. I don't think it solves the problem. Exports, I think your risk grows exponentially. From the world I'm from, any sort of physical movement of a product, depending on how you protect it in transit, opens up more risk. And if you're exporting overseas or to the US, I think your risks grow exponentially with that movement. And by nature right now, as we all can agree, the CBSA is very limited in their enforcement ability, just sheer manpower or people power. And I don't know how many of the exports are getting inspected for that. So from my perspective, I think companies need to do everything they can within their realm of possibility to protect those shipments going out, protect the Canadian brand, and make sure that wherever this is destined for, educate whoever the receiver is, whether it's another government importing medicinal marijuana, or as other markets open up for recreational use. I think we need to be educating the consumer on whatever brand protection is implemented by the LPs.
Spencer, couldn't agree with you more. 1 to 2% of all shipments are inspected.
Yeah.
An inspection doesn't mean they pull apart the shipment and look at everything. It could be they just look at the paperwork. 1 to 2%. However, the software programs and the programs that customs have in place are so good that I would venture that in the majority of cases where they suspect that there's counterfeit product, they know it before it's ever actually looked at, because there's something wrong with the paperwork, or they have other information that they're dealing with. And this is a classic example where, to get to a place that'll make Spencer happy and to make me happy, you have to partner. When we are looking for non-cannabis products with CBSA, we want CBSA to detain something. When you file your RFA, you have the ability to advise customs that you suspect a shipment is coming in or going out, and you provide them with whatever information you have, or you suspect that there's a business or person or entity that is counterfeiting and could be exporting or importing. You have the ability to give that information to CBSA. Where does that come from? That's not coming usually from law enforcement. That's coming from the brands enforcing their rights. Brands retain investigators, lawyers, others to find counterfeit, their own staff, they're finding counterfeit, they're reporting it, they're investigating it, and they're giving the information to customs. Does that mean that the Nikes and Apples and all these companies of the world expect law enforcement or expect customs to handle every case? Exact opposite. They don't expect them to handle anything except the bigger cases, but they have the information and they pass it on
Yep,
in partnership.
I agree with you, Lauren. And I think it brings us to a really interesting topic that you and I have spoke of before, which is, counterfeiting just doesn't, counterfeit protection or anti-counterfeiting does not just, start and stop with putting a label on a package potentially. This has to be a robust layered approach that starts at the very beginning with the internal makeup of the company, the internal structure of the LP. We say in the world that I come from that your biggest threat is always internal. That's where it starts. And if you're not addressing protection at that point and know that your outgoing supply or outgoing product is secure, you open up the world for the counterfeiters much easier, because the counterfeiters, especially the sophisticated ones, they're going to be attempting to infiltrate these companies that they've targeted to counterfeit. And that's a real threat. And we haven't talked about that much. So I just thought I would add that, because I think your threat dramatically decreases if security departments are going through appropriate screening processes, making sure that both physical and personnel security is absolutely second to none. Will go a long way in addressing the threat.
The funny thing is, Spencer, it's not funny at all, but yes, you have to, and we spend time educating companies, their own people, the people that are working in their offices, in their factories, and we'll go in, and people who do this kind of work will go in and educate their internal staff on what to look for. Who are your best partners? Are the people that know your product the most? Who knows your product the most? Your internal people. Those are the people that you want to partner with. You want to have a program in place, which you can do yourself, to educate them on what to do when they find counterfeit, for example, how to look for it, what they can do to protect themselves. And businesses want to protect their computer systems, so they have IT people come in, and these people come in and make sure everything is secure. It's all part and parcel of being safe and keeping your assets secure.
Right. And I think security breaches of the past in other industries have taught us that these are sophisticated crime syndicates that are really initiating these things, and it is possible that they can infiltrate your organization, and just be mindful of that would be a good thing to do. We're nearing the end of our conversation. I want to go around, just to ask you, for if you're speaking to cannabis producers today and talking to them about, as you mentioned, Laura, earlier, the producers, because it's such a young industry, the focus has been revenue generation, streamlining operations for operational efficiency. So this issue might not be top of mind. So if you're talking to them, what are the things that they should be looking at? How did they get to that point where they're really interested, looking at this and protecting their brands and their company? Let's start with you, Spencer. So
That's a
many
big,
things.
that's a big,
That's a big question.
That's a big question. I mean, I really think you have to do an environmental scan. I think, being honest with ourselves, whatever organization we're in or whatever business we're in, I think taking a very good hard look at what the problem is, defining that problem, what we're trying to solve, and then getting honest with what we are or aren't doing and where our gaps are. And I know that's a it's a pretty light answer in terms of the detail, but every organization is different. You have a different culture, you have different mandates, and so you really got to start at the organizational level that says, let's take a scan of our environment, let's understand what our real threats are, what are we trying to prevent, and what are we trying to protect against. And I think once you start there, you're going to start to answer some of those, more difficult questions about how do we protect against those threats.
Lorne? Can't read.
Do something.
Right.
You have to do something. Spencer's laid it out, and this is not a loaded question. It's an important question that has a very large answer, as to how you put a plan in place. But do something. You can do something, and it doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. You can contact an organization and get involved with that organization if that's the area you want to do something in. You have to realize that it's going to be a problem if it's not already, and you have to protect yourself from it, and you can put a plan in place without having to go and spend a lot of money. So the government actually does have some pretty good information on how to protect yourself vis-a-vis trademarks and copyrights. If you go to the Industry Canada website, it's actually excellent material. If you read it, it's really good, and it's not it doesn't even appear to be written by lawyers. It appears to be written by someone who interpreted what we lawyers actually said, because it makes a lot of sense. And so you can do things like that, and you can file some of your registered rights if you already have them. Do that. Like, do something, because it'll introduce you to other people that can help you. And the more people that are on your team, the better your program is going to be.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that I think we've got a great start with forums like this, with C3 leading the way in terms of providing a place of collection for thoughts and discussion and discourse. I think that's a great place to start, although, many of the LPs are competing with one another. We do have a Canadian industry we're trying to grow and protect. So I think having, the larger conversation and getting into the details by company, I think will be a recipe for success.
One more thing that we did discuss. Well, actually, you kind of mentioned it, but just looking at the whole supply chain, right? Is that something that you think kind of cannabis producers are looking at from the perspective of their products being counterfeited or security protection? Like, where are the weak links within the supply chain that they should be looking at?
Well, can I take this one, Lauren? You okay? I mean, what we've seen specific to the cannabis industry is everything from peripheral industry products getting counterfeited. This is everything from the pre-rolls to, other machinery that's used. I mean, we've seen these counterfeit cases. They've been in the news. And then, of course, we have the end user consumable level product that is getting copied and put into legitimate stores as legitimate products. So I think really the threat is real and it's out there, and it is not just the LPs who are at risk. I think the entire supply chain is at risk, and I think there needs to be anti-counterfeit activity and programs in place from, I know it's an overused term, but I'm going to use it, from seed to sale. It needs to be protected, and all the peripheral products and services that go along with it need to be protected.
Lord?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you can just look at the pharma industry, and if you look online, you see all of these pharmacies with Canadian flags online, and people believe that that's real. They believe they're buying the real product, and they've done studies to show this huge percentage of online pharmacies selling prescription drugs that are believed to be Canadian are trading on the reputation of Canada having good products and a secure supply chain, and they're counterfeit because they're not selling Canada's good products. They're selling counterfeits. And so nobody wants that to happen to the cannabis industry. They want to make sure that what is being sold is legitimate. And to do that, they have to catch up quick and have a good program in place.
And I think the Canadian brand is worth protecting. I don't know anybody who would disagree.
And we're first or second in the marketplace. We have the ability, if we get this right, to become the international leader when it comes to cannabis. Why not? Why can't Canada be number one?
Right. And on that note, that's a good note to end this very interesting and really eye-opening discussions. I want to thank you again, Spencer and Lorne, for joining us today. I'm sure we're gonna be talking a bit more about this and another roundtable down the road. We'll have a little bit more information and more stories to tell. Thanks again, guys. So again, for our audience, this webinar has been recorded, and you'll receive a copy, a link to the recording in your email inbox by tomorrow. So thank you again, and goodbye, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Marilyn.
Marilyn.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Spencer.
Lord. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.